This conference will now be recorded.
Hey everybody, Leah Slaughter, hope you're doing well. I'm going to try to keep this one short and sweet today, but there is quite a bit of information and material I'm going to cover. We have a lot of cities that are implementing these rental property registrations and inspections, and I think it's important that we go over what they are and the things that have to be done when you have a property going through this process. Some cities make it very easy and it's really not an issue. And then there are other cities that are a nightmare. And so I'm going to give some examples of what those are. We're going to talk about what it means, what type of properties it applies to, and who handles all of that. So as always, we've got our typical disclaimer. Everything here is our opinion and our best guess. Of course, there are no guarantees in real estate, and we do the best we can to guide you based on our experience and based on our knowledge. So now that that's out of the way, let's talk about what a rental property registration is, because I think a lot of people don't even realize what this is. And so a rental property registration is a process where we register the property as a rental property. And so this is not something that you do if you live in a property. It is not something you do if that property is on the market for sale. It is only what you do if you are going to be putting a tenant in that property. And one of the misconceptions is that you only have to register it with the city. That's not necessarily true. There are many neighborhoods or HOAs where we also have to register the property. And one big craze right now are HOAs passing these rental restrictions. And so this is something that we see a lot. And most of the changes that are going into effect have to do with the term of the lease. Some of the changes that we see going into effect have to do with approving the tenant. When we deal in a condo building or an apartment building where it's individually owned, we see this a lot, and it's something that I can really understand because you have people sharing common areas, you have people living under the same building, and so wanting to know the criminal background of the tenant going in there, I can certainly understand. And certainly as a multifamily owner, that's something that I always want to do for my other residents. But when they start treading on the rights of individual property owners in single family homes, that is where I start to have a problem. And so the difference between registering it with the city and registering it with the HOA is generally what information is going to be provided. So I'll talk about that a little more as we move on. So what is the difference between a registration and an inspection? So a registration is where we fill out paperwork and we basically tell them what the property address is, who you are, and I'll go through all the different paperwork that we typically see, but it is just an informative filing. There is no physical visit to the property. Now, some cities also do what's called an inspection. And what that means is that at some predetermined interval, some cities do it every move out and every move in, so one time as each tenant renews or leaves. And then some cities do it routinely yearly. And then some cities do it every 5 years. Some cities don't do it at all. So it really depends on where the property is. But the inspection is where they will actually send an inspector that is either an employee of the city or, as we saw with the city of Dallas, and I'm going to talk about that in a few minutes, we saw temp that were hired. And when temps are hired, it's very, very inconsistent. And so when we get a rental property inspection, we want to make sure that we get as much of the information of what needs to be fixed as possible. And some cities give us a check sheet to work from, but generally the types of things that we're going to note on a walkthrough are the types of things that you're going to see on a rental property inspection, but they're going to be even more critical. So at the end, I will talk about some of the most common items that we see that surprise us. And so you do the best you can to prepare for it, but unfortunately we can't always see everything because you just never know what they're going to look for in its entirety. I have seen them fail properties for something as small as the caulking under the sink where the pipe goes into the cabinet is not 100% sealed. And I have seen them fail it for major things like slow sewer drainage. I have seen them fail it for peeling paint on the exterior of a home built before 1978. Some ridiculous things. And so there is a difference between merely having to register versus having to register and inspect. And of course, your portfolio and your rental property is going to make a huge difference for that process. If you have a newer property or one that you've just renovated, you're a lot less likely to have a problem than, say, an inspection where they come out and you've got a 1970s or 80s home that's barely been touched. Now, the other thing that we have seen is a lot of cities, when they do an inspection, it's also a CO, or a certificate of occupancy. So very similar to what you do when you first build a property. And I've had them flag owners who either bought properties from other people or who did work themselves before they brought the property to us, where they didn't pull permits, things like water heaters or HVAC system replacements. They will actually flag that. Specific cities like Garland, Mesquite's a big one, and they will make you go back and get that fixed. So you'll have to hire a licensed plumber, get the proper permitting, and you just never know if and when they're going to catch it. But we see this a lot on properties that come over under management, and we get that first inspection done. So that is the difference between a registration and an inspection. Now, the big question is, why are they doing this? And using Dallas as an example, which is what we're going to go into next, Dallas had a lot of push to do this, and they were one of the largest cities to start implementing it. We have been registering properties with Dallas for a very long time. That's nothing new. They didn't really have a lot of enforcement about it. They very rarely caught when one wasn't done. Many owners really didn't want to do it, and it wasn't a huge deal. Then what happened is there was one rental property owner that he was doing a lot of low income housing. They were quasi owner finance deals, but he was preying on the elderly and preying on the poor, and the homes were condemnable. And it was a long legal battle, and you could Google it, or I can send a link out about it if you're interested, just let me know. And you can read that it took them years and years and years to finally get him shut down. And he is probably the largest reason why the city of Dallas now has an inspection program, and that's a yearly inspection program. So it's, number one, it's to protect people. It's to protect residents and renters from slumlords. And it's also, it makes money. You know, anything that a city does, they're going to charge for it. And so I do think it's a profit house for them. And I also think it's about consistency and controlling what's going on in the city. And so, you know, when we look at an HOA doing rental property registrations, it's very much about controlling the lease, controlling who's coming in and out, and controlling when properties go on the market. When we look at why a city is doing it, it is money making, making sure that people are not being slumlords, and it also cuts down on a lot of issues with properties. Because when we have a property that has a lot of problems, and not us, but just in general, a city, what happens is that property tends to have lots and lots of issues. They're higher risk for fires, they're higher risks for gas leaks, and they're higher risks for people getting hurt. And so really at the end of the day, that is why the cities are doing this process. Whether you agree with it or not, it's here, we have to deal with it. So only some cities require registrations and or inspections on 1 to 4 family properties. So that's your single families, your condos, your duplexes, your triplexes, your fourplexes. Most cities, and this is very, very just something that we've been dealing with for a long time, require cities to register multifamily properties. That's normal, and that I 100% agree with. It's these single families that have really seen the biggest change. And there's a lot of differences in how things have to be handled with single family. And when I say single family, we mean 1 to 4 family, and multifamily. Like, for example, in a single family lease or a fourplex lease, I can make the tenants responsible for pest control. I can make them, the downstairs tenants, responsible for lawn care. It's very easy. There's easy division between, you know, whose side is whose. And the cities really don't step on our toes. What we see when we get into multifamily is, even though I can hold the tenants accountable, so if the tenants bring in roaches, I can hold them accountable to pay for the remediation. Many of the cities are going to tell me, you can't make them actually do it. You are still responsible, which, as a multifamily owner and manager, we always want to handle it anyway, because you can't trust it to be done right by a resident or in the time frame we want or from the professional that we recommend. But there are big differences with some of the cities' registration programs of what their rules are pertaining to rental properties. Because what happens is we have Texas Property Code, and I'm probably going to add a class on that before long, because there's been a lot of updates on that. I actually think we may already have one on the calendar. And that property code is what dictates rental properties in Texas. But what happens is the cities go above and beyond that to further restrict and basically just create rules about rental properties. And so that is what we see in some of these areas. Dallas is a great example of that. And it's something that we just have to accommodate. And so when we deal with multifamily, we see it a lot. When we deal with single family, we just don't see it as much. Now, some of the documents which may be needed to register a property would be your ID or passport. They're often going to take my ID or passport as well. There's going to be specific forms for some of the HOAs in cities. Now, for the HOAs where we have to register the renter, there's also going to be release of liability forms if there's community features like a pool or a playground. There's often going to be a pass-through of liability, which is going to say something along the lines of, if your tenant visits the pool and they damage the premises, the landlord can be held responsible, that type of thing. There's going to be possibly some affidavits. Sometimes it may be an affidavit of ownership. It might be an affidavit of you being current on your mortgage, all sorts of things they may have. They also sometimes do lease addendums. Using my Dallas example, they have a crime prevention lease addendum, which has to be attached to the lease, that basically talks about whether or not the person has a criminal record, which it's an overreach in my opinion, but I think it's a way to track. There's insurance policy information may be requested to verify that you have up-to-date insurance, and then lien holder information, which I've never really understood why they want that information, but I'm guessing if they ever have to file against the property, they want to know who your mortgage is with. But again, very, very rare. Typically, they're just going to fine you if you're not in compliance. Now, let's talk about who handles this process. If we manage your property, we handle it for you. If we just list your property and you self-manage, then you've got to handle this process. So that's the real difference there. So if you were self-managing, then this is part of the process that you would have to handle. And keep in mind, as I mentioned, a lot of these cities, this has to be done at tenancy changeover. And I'll mention why in just a few minutes. The average registration fee that we see is about $30 to $100. I'd say around 50 is pretty much the average. And then the inspection fee, if there is one, is usually somewhere between $30 and $100 as well. I'd say 50 to 75 is the most common. And then follow-up inspections. So if they fail the property and they have to come back out and inspect again, some cities charge for that as well. And typically that's around $50 average. So there's a few fees associated with this for cities that implement it. And then here I've put just kind of a short list of cities. So you're going to see most of the major metropolitan areas do it: Houston, Dallas, College Station, Austin, and then a lot of the suburbs will do it. And what you'll notice is it's the larger suburbs or the suburbs that are like their own neighborhood. So Providence Village is a great example of that. So they are, in a way, their own city. They technically are, and so is Aubrey, but they're really kind of right together, and the city is the HOA. It's very convoluted. And so you're not only registering it with the city, you're registering it with the HOA, and we have to get a CO. So it's a very in-depth process, and it all has to happen before the tenant moves in, after the old tenant moves out. So when we do our 5 to 10 day turns, you can imagine how crazy that gets. But that is the process for that city. And as always, if you have any questions, your message box is there. Just leave them there for me and I will answer them for you. So let's review an example. As I mentioned, the city of Dallas. This is their check sheet. This is what they give us, and this is what they'll give you of the items that they are looking for. Now, this is actually their brochure that I've attached, so you'll have to forgive the layout a little bit. But what you will see is they call it that it empowers owners to be responsible for the quality of their tenants' housing and to promote healthy and safe neighborhoods in which they have a vested interest. And I'm not going to give much commentary on that other than to say that's what they call it. Now, you'll notice that there's an exterior checklist, there is an affidavit to be signed, and then kind of general violations, plumbing, utility. So things like air conditioning capable of maintaining a room temperature of at least 15 degrees cooler than the outside temperature, but no higher than 85. So this is one of those examples that goes over, above, and beyond Texas property code. All fixed systems, including unit covers, panels, blah, 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 and operating condition properly attached. So some of this is subjective too. Window mounted units installed in compliance with construction codes if provided, heating facilities capable of maintaining a room temperature of 15 degrees warmer than outside, but no lower than 68. Again, this is something over, above, and beyond property code. So these are the types of examples of the things that we are talking about. Now, you'll see plumbing fixtures connected and maintained in operating condition. I've seen them cite for things that just don't look pretty. My caulking example is a great one. I don't really think that having a pencil-sized hole in the caulking underneath the cabinet warrants a failed city inspection, but those are the types of things that we sometimes see. And so when Dallas rolled out their inspection program, they called us because we're one of their largest owners, and they said, we're going to have 60 days to get yours done, and we're just going to go almost every single day, and all of them have to be done in 60 days. Well, I guess they had a lot more rental properties in the city than they realized, because when they put the inspection program in place, I don't think they necessarily knew how many there were, because a lot of the people, when it was just registering, weren't doing it because there was no teeth in the program. They got very overwhelmed and they brought in temp employees. And so I want you to imagine a city, government run, bringing in temp employees to initiate some type of consistent inspections at rental properties. It was a nightmare. They would schedule a day with a list with us and then just not show up, or they would show up 4 hours late. It was quite an experience. And what we found was inconsistencies in the inspections. And so they might provide a list of 4 or 5 items that failed, and then we would fix those items. They would show back up to inspect, and then they would find a whole new list of items. And so this is something that we see a lot in Garland and Mesquite. We see it some of the areas around Houston, but not as much. And I think that's just because there's not as many rental properties. North Texas is it's inundated right now. And so anyway, we'll have one list and then we fix that list, and they come back and they might find a couple more items. So I had one example where we had this owner hire us to rent out their property, and they had just renovated it with a contractor. And we did the inspection, got a tenant. The inspector shows up, cites a bunch of stuff, get all that fixed. He shows back up and he goes, oh, wait a minute. This water heater's new. There's no permit on file. And that's the type of thing that we see in these inspections. And so generally they're pretty smooth. The newer the property, generally the smoother they go. But it is something to keep in mind that if they fail something and you fix it, it doesn't necessarily mean they're not going to find something new at the next visit. They don't just check the items they failed the first time all the time. Sometimes they recheck the entire property. So this is the FAQ from the city of Dallas, and I picked and chose some of the questions that I thought were important to discuss. And so one of those is, what is the purpose of Chapter 27? And again, this minimum property standards is how they word this: to protect the health, safety, morals, and welfare of Dallas residents by establishing minimal standards. What rental properties must be registered? All non-owner occupant structures, including single family, each duplex unit, and independent condominium units. Now this FAQ was about the single family program, so we're not talking about multifamily in this FAQ. What's the fee? So you'll notice for Dallas, the fee is $43 a year. And then if violations are identified at the time of the inspection, a follow-up inspection will be $43. Now, when they fail the property, often they're going to grade the failure, which means how urgent or how severe is it versus how minor is it. And based on the grading will determine how long you have to get those items remedied. So if it's a health or safety hazard that's urgent, they may only give you 24 to 48 hours. But if it's something small like exterior paint, they may give you 2 weeks or a month. So when you get the failed report back, or when we get it back, we can assess the timing to make sure everything is in compliance. And at the end of all of it, we will do a reinspection. But sometimes if they fail a health or safety item, like they find a gas leak on the furnace, they will come back in 48 hours to make sure it's been fixed, and they'll just show up. So again, it depends by the city, but this is how Dallas operates. Now, here's an interesting one. For those of you that used to live in your property and you bring it to us to manage or lease out, my job has been relocated outside of Dallas and I'm renting the house until it sells. Is registration mandatory? So you'll notice there's an exemption for this. So if you've had a homestead exemption within the last 2 years, you do not have to register the property. So that's an interesting one. And I guess they assume because if you lived there, it's inhabitable condition, and that you wouldn't live there possibly if it wasn't inhabitable condition. So that's where that exemption comes from. Now, here's another one. Am I eligible for a refund if I sell my property? The answer is no, you are not eligible for a refund. Is the city inspection required? You'll see yes. In addition to the required annual inspection, they will conduct an inspection at least once every 5 years, but not more frequently than once a year. Is air conditioning required in all rental properties? Now here is an interesting one. The owner must provide refrigerated air equipment capable of maintaining room temperature at least 15 degrees lower than the outside temperature, but no higher than 85. So for those of you with window units, this is something that comes into play because sometimes in 105 or 108 degree heat, it's very hard with window units to get an entire unit below 85. So here they are talking about over, above, and beyond property code, what the requirements are. It is very rare that someone brings us a property to manage that does not have heat or air, but it does happen. And so in this case, that property would have to be brought up to today's requirements under the city registration, which we typically make them do that anyway. I don't feel right in Texas people not having air, but there are some older properties that just haven't been retrofitted with window AC or central air. So total side note, but whenever I buy a property and I renovate it, I always put in central air. It does not matter whether it has it or not. It does not matter if it's on window units. One of my requirements as a rental owner to make me feel good is that it has central air. So even my $600 units that either have window units or had nothing, I still go back in and install central air. So how is mold addressed? This is a big one. The city of Dallas does not inspect for mold, but will address any violation that is contributing to the excess accumulation of moisture. Now, what they don't tell you is that they do have code compliance. And so that's completely separate. And so code violations can be called in or complained on, and then they would come out and inspect that. But they treat it like two different departments, even though it's all kind of under this one umbrella. So this goes back to my bug kind of comment a little bit ago. Who is responsible for removing bed bugs? So if you read the lease, it's the tenant. The tenant is fully responsible. Goes back to that age-old question of, do we want them to take care of it and us rely on them to do it, or do we want to do it and bill it back to them? Well, Dallas goes a step above and beyond that in clarifying. So where evidence of an infestation exists, the owner of a building, structure, or property, including a vacant or occupied one, two-family, blah, 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 shall eliminate the infestation using a person licensed under the Texas Structural Pest Control Act. So we also have to repair any condition that contributes to an infestation. Now you tell me that's not a gray area. So if your tenant comes in and your tenant brings bed bugs, you have to eradicate it. Doesn't say we can't bill them back for it, but it does say it's our responsibility to eradicate, even on a one or two family dwelling, so a single family or a duplex. So again, this is over, above, and beyond property code. Are tenants responsible for bulky trash or high weeds? It says ultimately the property owner is held responsible for all violations. Attempts will be made to notify the tenants. So when you get a violation from the city or from your HOA, this is the type of thing you're seeing. Yes, we can hold the tenants accountable, but ultimately they're going to make sure you pay that bill. Some utility companies also make the owner responsible for utility bills. And so some of these same cities that are acting more ridiculous about this registration program, they are often the same ones that put in place where you are responsible for the water bill if the tenant doesn't pay it. It's not a real common thing, but if the tenant doesn't pay it, you can be responsible in some of these cities. So that's something to keep in mind as you're looking at different areas. Now, what is the required hot water temperature? You'll notice it says it's 110 degrees. And then what languages are required for written leases? It must be provided in the occupant's primary language, if that is English, Spanish, or Vietnamese, upon occupant's request. Now that's interesting because a lot of the forms and leases are not translated, and we cannot sign a non-English lease. So again, over, above, and beyond property code. That's actually a request I've never had though. Must I register a house occupied by a relative? So we have a lot of clients who they buy a property to rent to their child while they're in college, or maybe to their sibling or a cousin. And so that is an exemption here. So if it's a relative by blood or marriage, it does not need to be registered, but you do have to provide the affidavit, one of those forms I mentioned, stating that fact. Now, what happens if you don't register your single family? Failure to register is a violation of City of Dallas code. It can be a violation by the code officer, and citations can be issued, and there are fines, and typically the fines are daily. So all of that being said, we talked about the inconsistencies with this. Different results every time when we have temporary or different inspectors. And I also mentioned Section 8 inspectors. So we have a lot of housing properties, and you will notice that housing will find a completely different list of items than what the city will find or the HOA will find. So don't think because one of them passed it and didn't find anything that the other one will not. Not everybody is as thorough as they should be. Now, what if you don't want to register? I've had owners come to me and say, I absolutely will not register my property. I'm not going to do it. Well, it's really not a choice. Number one, we have to follow state and city municipal laws. We have to. But some of the fines are up to $500 a day. I have never seen them implement it that high, but it can and could happen. So Carrollton is the example I give here. Their fines are $500 a day. Usually they're going to give you a warning first, just FYI. Now, some cities don't even allow the tenant to move in until it's registered and inspected. So Mesquite, Garland, those are good examples of those types of policies. Some cities won't allow the tenant to get water turned on. So the water department actually is the one who verifies as well that the registration and or inspection has been done. And then others won't release the meter for power. So Aubrey, Providence Village are great examples of that, where you'll see those types of limitations as well. Now, I think that's all I was going to cover. The only thing that I would like to add are some of the items that those of you with older properties, I'd like to make you aware of that they will look for. So I'm sure many of you have heard about lead-based paint, and the cutoff for that is 1978. And so if you have a home that has a painted siding, and if you watch my Facebook, you see I just bought one of these multifamilies I'm renovating, and the entire outside is just peeling paint everywhere. That's the type of thing that they're going to cite you for. No, do I think that peeling paint on the exterior is a hazard? No. But in their mind it is, because that paint very well could have lead-based paint in it. The child could very well eat it or cut themselves on it or whatever it may be. And so that is a very common citation that I see. Another one are sidewalks and concrete areas. If your concrete has dropped, if the sidewalk has dropped, and it poses a potential trip hazard, and the allowance for that is very minimal. So it doesn't have to be a significant drop for them to consider that a trip hazard. So that would be something that they would cite. Your water pressure can be something that they would cite. Your meter running could be something that they could cite. If your fans don't work properly. So one of the things I always tell people is if you leave it in the property, it needs to work. So say that you've got a vent fan in the bathroom that breaks and you say, well, I really don't want to replace it. It's not really necessary. Well, number one, we want it to be there to keep the moisture out. But number two, if it is present and it does not work, they will cite it. So that's really important. And then the biggest thing, and probably the biggest thing that we deal with on a day-to-day basis, is biological growth. And this is an issue that we see a lot down in Houston and Galveston and all of our kind of coastal areas, that if you have even the slightest bit of biological growth in the property, they say often they're not going to look for that, but they do. And really, in reality, you're going to have already heard it from us. It's already going to be in the process of remediation. But if you bring a property to us and you say, hey, I just gutted this house ready for you to lease it out, and we get that call all day, every day, then when we go to lease it out, if we find some of these issues, keep in mind that just because you ignore it on our walkthrough report doesn't mean that they're not going to tell you the same things and then put the iron fist down. So just keep that in mind. The older the property, definitely the more I would expect to be found. And at the end of the day, make sure when you buy a property and the seller tells you things have been replaced, make sure that they pulled permits, make sure it was done properly if it was done by a professional and it was done by a third party. So upcoming classes I've put here for you guys. So March 10th, where are Leah and Michael buying property and why? Then we're going to go over the tenant move out process. Now, I don't know who all's going to Expo this weekend, but we are title sponsor at Lifestyles Expo this weekend in Houston. I hope to see some of you there. Going to be some great education, both from us and others, and just a great time getting together with other investors and learning what everyone is doing. So we'll be teaching 4 classes and hope to see some of you guys there. March 31st, we're going to go over walkthroughs and why they're so important. This is one of my favorite classes to teach because a lot of people who come to us that have never heard of a walkthrough before, they don't really understand why we do them, specifically our clients from California and other areas where they're not allowed. It's hard to understand why we take on the responsibility of going into that property multiple times a year. So we're going to talk about why, and I'm going to show you some horror stories of what happens when we take over a property that hasn't been visited. How a military law lease breach works. This will be on April 14th. This is an important one because we're seeing a lot of military service members, especially in some of the markets that we work in. And so this talks about how that process works. It's actually very favored to the landlord as well, but it's something that we want to go over. And then finally, cashing out versus selling for a profit. How to make a decision whether you're going to leverage the equity in your property with a cash out or whether you should sell in 1031 exchange, and how you determine the difference. And I'll give you a hint. The key difference is the rent price. How does it rent return? Anyway, thank you so much for joining us as always. This will be on YouTube in about an hour. And otherwise, hope to see you guys this coming weekend, or we'll see you on a class in a couple weeks. Take care, everybody.